"Sir, don't open that door." The man stepped off his porch and crossed the lawn toward me before I could reach my son's front steps. 3 days later, I understood why those 5 words saved my wife's life. The drive from Charlotte to Raleigh takes about 2 hours on I-40, longer when your mind keeps wandering to things you can't explain. Margaret had been visiting our son and daughter-in-law for 10 days. 10 days was normal. She loved spending time with them, loved playing grandmother to their dog, loved the way Cassie made her feel needed in the kitchen. What wasn't normal was 4 days of silence. Margaret didn't go 4 days without calling me. She called every morning, sometimes twice. Little things, mostly. The cardinal she'd spotted in the backyard, something funny she'd heard on the radio, the way the light hit the lake at dusk. After 42 years of marriage, we'd developed a rhythm so automatic that breaking it felt physically wrong, like skipping a heartbeat. I'd told myself the usual things. Phone battery, bad signal, maybe they'd taken a day trip somewhere remote. I'd tried Brandon's number and gotten voicemail 3 times. Cassie's number, same result. I texted them both and watched the messages sit unread. By the 4th morning, I stopped telling myself anything and just got in the car. The neighborhood outside Raleigh, where Brandon and Cassie lived, was the kind of place that looked exactly like prosperity without quite achieving it. Wide streets, attached garages, identical mailboxes. Brandon had bought the house 3 years ago when his IT consulting work was steady. Since then, the work had gotten less steady. He hadn't mentioned it to me directly, but Margaret had let things slip over the months. A contract that didn't renew. Cassie's yoga studio, hemorrhaging members, the quiet desperation that hides behind carefully maintained lawns. I pulled up to the curb in front of their house and killed the engine. The afternoon was warm for October, the kind of Carolina fall that still carries summer in its edges. I grabbed the bag of groceries Margaret had asked me to bring on my last visit and started up the front walk. That's when I heard him. "Sir, don't open that door." He was already moving, a compact man in his early 50s, gray at the temples, wearing a flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed up. He came from the house directly to the left, stepping over the low hedge that divided the properties, his expression carrying something I recognized from my years as a forensic accountant, reading people across conference tables. Urgency mixed with guilt about having waited too long. "Are you Harold?" he asked, slightly out of breath when he reached me. "Margaret's husband?" The groceries nearly fell out of my hands. "Who are you? How do you know my wife's name?" "Frank Torres. I live next door." He pointed back at the house he'd come from. "I've been watching for you. Margaret mentioned you'd probably come, eventually." He stopped, looked at the ground for just a moment. "Something happened here, sir. About 6 days ago. I should have called the police sooner. I want you to know that." The street was quiet around us. A lawnmower somewhere in the distance. A car passing slowly at the far end of the block. "Tell me," I said. Frank told me. He'd been up late, around 11 on a Tuesday, when he heard a sound from Brandon's house that he initially thought was the television turned too loud. Then he realized it wasn't the television. It was a woman's voice, rising and falling, repeating the same word over and over. He'd gone to his front window. Through the glass, he could see movement in Brandon's living room, shapes shifting behind the curtains. He'd heard the word clearly then. "Help!" Margaret's voice saying help. He'd gone outside and knocked on Brandon's door. Brandon had answered in under a minute. "Too fast," Frank said, like he'd been standing right behind it. Cassie was visible over his shoulder, standing very still in the hallway. Brandon told Frank that everything was fine, that his mother had had too much wine and gotten confused, that she was just tired and going to bed. His voice was calm. His face was not. Frank had gone back inside. He'd told himself it wasn't his business. He'd told himself Brandon probably knew best about his own mother. He'd lain awake listening until the sounds from next door stopped, and then he'd slept badly. And in the morning, both cars were in the driveway, but nobody answered when he knocked again. On the 3rd day, both cars were gone. The house was locked. Frank had found a folded piece of paper tucked under his windshield wiper that morning, though he hadn't gone looking for it. It was in Margaret's handwriting. 5 words, pressed hard into the paper like someone writing under difficult circumstances. "Tell Harold, please. I'm sick." He'd kept the note. He'd told himself he'd call me when he found the right number. He hadn't called. Now, he was standing in front of me on a quiet street, with the note folded in his shirt pocket, and the expression of a man who already understood the weight of what he'd failed to do. I held the note for a long moment after he handed it to me. Margaret's handwriting, the particular slope of her letters that I'd known for decades. The paper was slightly creased. She'd pressed hard enough to leave impressions on both sides. I called emergency services while Frank stood watching. The operator confirmed an ambulance had been dispatched to this address 6 days ago at 11:47 p.m. The patient, a woman matching Margaret's description, had been transported to WakeMed North in Raleigh. Serious condition. I called WakeMed North. 4 transfers, 3 holds. Finally, a nurse in the ICU with a careful voice who confirmed that a patient matching Margaret's description, admitted without identification as Jane Doe, was in stable condition as of that morning, and that next of kin should come in person. I told Frank I was calling the police. He nodded and said he'd give a full statement, whatever I needed, however I could use it. I believed him. He looked like a man who had been sitting with a decision for 6 days and was relieved to finally have it made for him. The drive to WakeMed North took 22 minutes. I know, because I watched the clock the entire way. The ICU on the 3rd floor had the particular silence of rooms where people are fighting. Machines providing a steady rhythm, footsteps muffled, voices hushed. A detective was waiting near the elevator when I stepped off. A tall woman named Patricia Okafor, who introduced herself and told me she'd received my call and come directly. She had the kind of face that gave nothing away, and the kind of eyes that missed nothing. She asked me questions in the hallway for several minutes before letting me see Margaret. When did she arrive at Brandon's house? When did communication stop? What did I know about their financial situation? Did Margaret have any prescription medications? I answered everything. Then I asked mine. What happened to my wife? Detective Okafor's jaw tightened in a way that told me she was deciding how much to say. She said enough. Margaret had been admitted with elevated levels of a blood pressure medication in her system, significantly elevated, combined with a sedative that she had not been prescribed. The combination had caused her heart rate to drop dangerously low. She'd been unconscious for most of her hospitalization. She was breathing on her own now, which the doctors considered significant progress. The word poisoning was not said in the hallway, but it was present in every sentence Detective Okafor used. Margaret's room was dim. The curtains were drawn against the afternoon light, and the machines beside her bed gave the room a quiet mechanical pulse. She looked smaller than she had 10 days ago. Her hair was loose against the pillow, which she would have hated if she'd known. Margaret was particular about her hair. I pulled a chair close and took her hand. Cold, lighter than it should have been. I sat and held it and didn't say anything for a long time. Somewhere around midnight, her fingers moved against mine. It took another hour before she could speak, and the words that came out were rough, damaged sounding, not quite her voice. The nurse brought ice chips and held the cup while Margaret worked through the effort of consciousness, blinking at the room, at the machines, at me. "How long?" she managed. 6 days, I said. She absorbed that, closed her eyes briefly, opened them again with something different in them. Something that had been processed in the dark. "Brandon," she said. Not a question. I held her hand tighter and waited. She described what she remembered in pieces over the next hour, with Detective Okafor present and recording. Cassie had made dinner on a Tuesday night. Chicken and rice, a meal Margaret had eaten in that house many times. About 90 minutes after eating, her heart had begun to race, then slow, then race again. Dizziness so severe she couldn't stand. She'd called for Brandon from the guest room. He'd come and told her it was probably just travel fatigue, that she should drink some water and lie down. She'd asked him to call an ambulance. He'd said it wasn't necessary. Her heart, she kept saying. Something was wrong with her heart. She'd gotten herself to the hallway at some point, intending to find her phone. Cassie had been standing in the kitchen doorway watching her, not moving, not helping. just watching with an expression that Margaret described, her voice going flat and careful on the words, as patient. She'd made it to the front door. Brandon had been there, his hand flat against the wood above the handle. She'd said, "Please." She'd said, "Brandon, please, I need help." And he'd said, "Mom, you need to go back to bed. You're confused." She'd screamed after that. She remembered screaming. She remembered Brandon's voice through the door telling someone outside that everything was fine, just a nightmare, no emergency. Then, nothing. Just waking up here. Detective Okafor stopped the recording and gave Margaret a glass of water in a moment. Then she asked, quietly, whether Margaret knew if Brandon or Cassie had access to any medications, blood pressure medications specifically, or sedatives. Margaret thought for a moment. She told Okafor that Cassie had mentioned high blood pressure at some point last year, that there were pill bottles on the bathroom counter in the master bedroom, that she hadn't paid attention to the names. After Okafor left, Margaret turned to look at me directly for the first time. Her eyes were clearer now, steadier. "Did you already know?" she asked. "I suspected," I said. "The finances, the questions about the estate. I suspected for a while that something was wrong. I told you it was nothing. You told me family doesn't think the worst of family." She looked at the ceiling. "I was wrong." I squeezed her hand. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Everything I know how to do," I said. 31 years as a forensic accountant teaches you one thing above all others. Money leaves marks. Every transaction, every transfer, every desperate decision made at 3 in the morning when the bills are due, all of it leaves a trail. People believe they can erase these marks. They cannot. The marks just get harder to read. I called Daniel Marsh the next morning. Daniel had worked alongside me for 12 years at the firm, handled the investigative side of cases while I handled the financial architecture. He was semi-retired now, but he owed me 3 favors, and I intended to collect one of them immediately. He called back in 48 hours with a file that I read at Margaret's bedside while she slept. Brandon's consulting business had lost its 2 largest contracts in the same quarter 8 months ago. Combined revenue loss, just under $200,000 annually. Cassie's yoga studio had closed in September, 1 month before Margaret's visit, with $47,000 in outstanding debt to vendors and landlord. Their mortgage was 63 days past due. A lender had filed a notice of default 2 weeks before Margaret arrived. On top of that, Brandon had opened 3 separate lines of credit in the past year, maxing 2 of them. The third was current, barely, funded by cash advances from the other 2. Total personal debt, not counting the mortgage, $118,000. Margaret and I had built a careful life over 42 years. The house in Charlotte was paid off. My retirement accounts totaled $940,000. The investment portfolio Margaret had managed with quiet, steady competence since her nursing career ended held another $680,000. Our estate, as it currently stood, was worth roughly $2.3 million, all of it passing to Brandon as our only child under the will we'd signed 6 years ago. Daniel had found one additional item. Brandon had called an estate planning attorney in Raleigh 9 weeks before Margaret's visit. The attorney's receptionist had confirmed the appointment in a brief conversation. The inquiry had been about probate timelines, about what happens when one spouse survives another, about whether an only child could expedite the administration of an estate when the surviving spouse suffered from cognitive decline. He'd used the phrase cognitive decline specifically. Margaret, who had completed 3 5K runs in the past year and could recite the phone numbers of every nurse she'd ever supervised, did not suffer from cognitive decline. I read that part to Margaret when she woke up. She was quiet for a very long time. "He called 9 weeks ago," she said finally. "Yes." "And then he invited me to visit." "Yes." She turned her face toward the window. The October light came in flat and pale through the gap in the curtains. She didn't cry. I had known Margaret for 44 years, been married to her for 42, and I had seen her cry perhaps a dozen times. This was not one of them. "My own son," she said. The words sat between us, with nowhere to go. I called our estate attorney, Patricia Lund, the following afternoon. I explained the situation plainly, and asked for an emergency appointment. She fit me in the next morning. In her office, I signed a revised will. Everything to Margaret. If Margaret predeceased me, everything to the oncology wing of Atrium Health, where she had worked for 19 years. Brandon's name appeared nowhere in the document. A no-contest clause was added, specifying that any legal challenge to the will would result in the challengers forfeiting any potential claim in any subsequent action. Patricia handled it without excess commentary. That is what I have always valued about her. Detective Okafor called me Friday afternoon while I was sitting in the hospital parking garage going over Daniel's financial report for the third time. "We executed a search warrant on your son's residence this morning," she said. I noted the date and time on my legal pad. "We found two things of particular interest. First, a prescription bottle for amlodipine in the master bathroom, prescribed to Cassie. 30 pills prescribed 2 months ago, 14 pills remaining." She paused. "Toxicology confirmed elevated amlodipine in your wife's bloodstream. Combined with the lorazepam we also found, the dosage was consistent with intentional rather than accidental exposure." "What was the second thing?" I asked. "Brandon's laptop. Browser history going back 7 weeks. Another pause. Searches for amlodipine overdose cardiac effects. Lorazepam combined with calcium channel blockers. How long does it take for beta blocker overdose to be fatal? Undetectable poisoning methods in food." I wrote each item down in my shorthand, the same way I had written case notes for 3 decades. "That's premeditation," I said. "It's consistent with premeditation," Okafor said carefully. "The DA's office is reviewing now. I wanted you to know." I called James Whitfield next. Jim had been my attorney for personal matters since before Brandon was born. Civil litigation, estate disputes, the occasional complicated transaction. He was 71 now and handled only the cases that interested him. This case would interest him. He answered on the second ring and listened for 12 minutes without interrupting, which is how I knew he was already building something in his mind. "Wrongful injury," he said when I finished. "Intentional infliction of emotional distress. Medical expenses. We can file simultaneously with the criminal investigation. The civil case creates discovery pressure, forces them to answer questions under oath, and freezes assets before they can transfer anything to protect it." "What's the exposure?" "Between medical bills and punitive damages, I'd put it at $1.8 million, maybe 2. "File it," I said. The papers were served on a Saturday morning. I know because Brandon called me at 11:14 a.m., and I let it ring twice before answering. His voice was controlled at first. "Dad, this is insane. There's been a huge misunderstanding. Mom wasn't well. She was confused. We were trying to help her. We were scared, and we didn't handle it right. The lawsuit is going to destroy us." I listened. I thought about Margaret in the ICU with tubes in her arms. I thought about her pressing a note into Frank Torres's hands in the dark. "You stood at the door," I said, "while your mother asked you for help." Brandon's control cracked. His voice went loud. "You don't know what happened. You only know what she told you. She was disoriented from the medication. She doesn't remember it right. You're choosing a version of events that makes us criminals instead of your own son. How can you do this to your family? How can you do this to your mother?" Silence. "There's no version of this that ends with a conversation, Brandon. See you in court." I ended the call. The media coverage started within 3 days of the civil filing. A reporter at the Raleigh News and Observer had found the court documents, which were public record, and run a short item. Charlotte Station picked it up the following day. Brandon's attorney, a man named Gregory Faust, who specialized in high-profile criminal defense, gave a statement suggesting the lawsuit was the vindictive response of a controlling father, unable to accept that his wife had accidentally taken too much of her own medication while under emotional stress. The phrasing was careful and deliberate. Emotional stress, her own medication, accident. Faust gave Brandon and Cassie a sit-down interview that ran on the same day the criminal charges were formally announced. The charges came Thursday, both of them. Attempted murder in the first degree. Conspiracy. Obstruction. Faust had somehow managed to run the interview before the charges landed in the public record, getting their sympathetic presentation out before the damning ones. The piece showed them at their kitchen table. Cassie was crying. Brandon looked exhausted and confused, the expression of a man bewildered by the cruelty of the system closing around him. He spoke about his deep love for his mother. He spoke about the terrifying night when she'd become ill, and they'd done their best in an impossible situation. He spoke about me with careful, pained restraint, saying only that his father had always had difficulty accepting that people could make mistakes without being criminals. Faust had done excellent work. I recognized it professionally, the same way you can recognize a well-constructed fraud and still find it repugnant. My phone started filling with calls. Former colleagues from the firm. People Margaret and I had known for years. Each one approached the subject from a slightly different angle, but the angle was always the same. Are you certain about this? Is it possible you're seeing things through the lens of fear rather than fact? Sometimes loved ones misremember trauma. I understood what was happening. Faust was managing the jury pool before a single jury had been selected. He was building an alternate story in the minds of anyone who might eventually be asked to evaluate the evidence. It almost worked. On the third day, I found myself reading the interview again in the early morning before Margaret woke up, and for approximately 4 minutes, I experienced genuine doubt. Not about what I knew, about whether what I knew would be enough. Margaret found me there when she woke. She watched me from the hospital bed for a moment without speaking. "You're reading the interview again," she said. "Yes." "Stop." I looked at her. "Harold." Her voice was very steady. Brandon stood at that door. I know what I asked him, and I know what he did. No newspaper article changes what happened in that house. She paused. "Don't let them make you uncertain about what I actually experienced." I put the phone face down on the side table. "You're right," I said. "I'm always right," she said. "You've known this for 42 years. It was the first joke she'd made since the hospital. I held on to it for days. The civil case produced its first major result on Tuesday. Jim Whitfield had filed for an emergency asset freeze, presenting Daniel's financial analysis to the court. Judge Calloway reviewed the motion and granted it within 24 hours. Brandon and Cassie's bank accounts were frozen. No property transfers permitted. The house they'd pledged to secure bail was locked in legal limbo. Faust filed a counter-objection. Jim countered the counter. The court upheld the freeze. Meanwhile, the criminal case was developing in ways I wasn't entirely aware of until Okafor called me the following Thursday morning. "Cassie broke," she said. I put down my coffee. "Tell me." "We brought them in separately yesterday for follow-up questioning. Standard procedure when we have contradictions between initial statements." Cassie held for about 40 minutes. Then her attorney stepped out briefly to take a call, and she just started talking. Okafor's voice was measured. She said it was Brandon's idea from the beginning, that he presented it to her as the only solution after the second contract fell through and the studio debt hit. That she hadn't fully understood what she was agreeing to until Margaret was actually ill in the guest room. And then she helped anyway. She confirmed mixing the medication into the food. She confirmed telling Brandon when Margaret started showing symptoms. She confirmed standing in the kitchen while Brandon blocked the hallway. I wrote everything down. "The DA is offering Brandon a cooperation deal," Okafor continued. "His attorney hasn't responded yet, but given what Cassie gave us, the offer is going to be persuasive. What happens if he doesn't take it? Then they both go to trial with his wife's testimony against him and a laptop full of research on how to poison someone undetectably. His odds are not good either way." I thanked her and called Jim Whitfield. He already knew. His sources at the DA's office were well maintained. "Once Cassie's testimony is on record, Brandon is going to fold," he said. "He's always been the weaker of the two, from what you've told me." This was his plan and his desperation. When the consequences become concrete, people like Brandon discover that loyalty has limits. 2 days later, Brandon accepted the cooperation deal. He sat for a deposition that lasted 6 hours, according to Jim's contact at the DA's office, and confirmed every detail of the plan. The research on the medications, the choice of amlodipine because Cassie's prescription was already in the house and wouldn't raise flags. The decision to invite Margaret for an extended visit specifically because their financial crisis had reached a point where they could no longer see any other exit. The discussions that had gone on for weeks before her arrival. The night itself, Brandon's own account, Margaret asking him for help, and his answer being to close the door. He said that last part with what the detective present described as minimal visible emotion. That detail, when Jim reported it to me, affected me in a way I hadn't expected. Not the cruelty itself. I'd known about that for weeks. The calmness, the way a person could make a choice like that and then describe it afterward without flinching. Jim called on a Tuesday with the final update on the cooperation deal. Brandon pleads to attempted murder second degree, 12 to 15 years, eligible for parole at 10. He testifies fully against Cassie. Cassie faces first-degree charges, and the DA intends to push for the maximum. And civil liability? The cooperation agreement doesn't touch civil liability. Whatever judgment we get, both of them are on the hook. The bankruptcy they've already filed just means we're first in line when they exit prison and have anything attachable. The arrest warrants for Cassie had been issued while Brandon was completing his deposition. She was taken into custody at 6:40 the evening at a friend's apartment in Durham, where she had been staying since the asset freeze made their house effectively uninhabitable. I told Margaret that night. She was in the living room of our Charlotte house, finally home after 3 weeks of recovery. She'd been sitting with a book open in her lap, but not reading it, which she did now sometimes, sitting with the shape of a normal activity while her mind worked through something private. She looked up when I came in. "Cassie's in custody," I said. Margaret set the book on the side table. She folded her hands. She looked at the window for a moment, where the evening was settling into the city outside. "And Brandon? He'll be sentenced within the month." She nodded. Very slowly, she reached forward and picked up the framed photograph on the end table. Brandon, at maybe 8 years old, standing beside me at the edge of a lake in the Smoky Mountains, both of us grinning at the camera with fishing poles, and nothing caught. She looked at the picture for a long moment. Then she laid it face down on the table and left her hand resting on the back of it. She didn't explain the gesture. She didn't need to. The weeks that followed were full of procedures and filings and court dates, the machinery of consequence grinding forward on its own schedule. Brandon's sentencing was set for late November. Cassie's case moved toward trial with the accumulated weight of her husband's testimony, the laptop evidence, the toxicology, and the witness statement from Frank Torres, who had given his full account to the police and then come to Charlotte specifically to speak with Margaret in person. He'd brought flowers and apologized 3 times. Margaret had thanked him and poured him coffee and told him that his decision to call the ambulance was the only reason she was alive to receive him. That meeting was the first time I saw Margaret cry since the hospital. "Not at anything," Frank said. At the end of it, when he stood to go, she touched his arm and said thank you in the particular way people say it when they mean something much larger than the words contain. The media had turned by then. The sympathetic framing Faust had constructed evaporated quickly after Curtis's cooperation became public, and the laptop evidence started appearing in news reports. The Raleigh station ran a correction of sorts, a follow-up piece that presented the actual evidence in detail. The legal expert they brought on called it calculated and premeditated, without apparent hesitation. The same people who had called me to express gentle doubt called again to say they'd had no idea the evidence was so comprehensive. I was polite about it. There was nothing useful in being otherwise. Cassie's trial lasted 4 days. With Brandon's testimony, the toxicology, the search history, and Frank's statement, there was not much for her defense to work with. The jury deliberated for 7 hours and returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Attempted murder in the first degree, conspiracy, obstruction of justice. She received 18 years. Parole eligibility at 15. Brandon's sentencing happened the same week. 13 years for attempted murder in the second degree, the judge citing his cooperation as a mitigating factor while making clear from the bench that cooperation had limits as mitigation when the crime involved a son's premeditated attempt to kill his mother for inheritance money. I was in the courtroom for both proceedings. Margaret was beside me. We sat in the 3rd row, close enough to see their faces. When the judge read Cassie's sentence, she looked at the wall above the judge's head and kept her face very still. When the sentence for Brandon was read, he turned and looked directly at me for the first time since any of this had begun. I don't know what he expected to see. I kept my face exactly as I had learned to keep it in 31 years of courtrooms. Patient, attentive, resolved. He looked away first. The civil judgment came 3 weeks later. Judge Whitmore awarded us $1. $7 million. The full amount requested, covering Margaret's medical expenses, rehabilitation costs, ongoing therapy, and punitive damages reflecting the deliberate, premeditated nature of the harm. Brandon and Cassie had both filed personal bankruptcy, and their assets at this point amounted to very nearly nothing. The foreclosed house had sold at auction for less than the mortgage balance. Bank accounts had been empty since the freeze. Jim Whitfield explained the judgment to me over the phone with the calm pragmatism of a man who has spent 50 years in law. We'll never see a dollar of it in the near term. But the judgment doesn't expire. It attaches to any future earnings, any inheritance they might receive, any settlement or windfall. If either of them ever has money, we can pursue it. And it's public record. Permanent documentation of what they did and what they owe. That's enough, I said. Most people want the money. Most people weren't forensic accountants, I said. I know what a permanent public record does to someone's financial future. That judgment follows them out of prison. That's the appropriate consequence. The month after sentencing, I received a letter. It had been processed through the prison mail system and carried the institutional stamp of the correctional facility where Brandon was beginning his sentence. The return address was in his handwriting. I recognized it immediately. He had my handwriting, the same slope, the same tendency to crowd letters at the end of words. I'd always noticed that without thinking much about it. I opened it at the kitchen table. 3 pages. I read them once, carefully, the way I'd read every financial document and every piece of evidence in this case. Looking for substance, looking for genuine meaning beneath the surface. Brandon wrote about the debt, about the pressure that had built until he couldn't see past it, about the months of sleepless nights and the desperation that had led him to a conclusion he described now as delusional. He wrote that he loved his mother. He wrote that he was sorry. He asked if there was any path forward, any version of the future where what he had done could be acknowledged and forgiven, and the family could find its way back to something. I read it twice. Then I read the part about finding a path forward a 3rd time. Then I got a piece of paper and wrote a response. 1 page, brief. Brandon, you researched how to kill your mother for 7 weeks before she arrived. You blocked the door while she begged you for help. You stood in that house watching her die and chose to do nothing. The courts have addressed what that means legally. This letter addresses what it means otherwise. There is no path forward. There is no family to return to. Any future correspondence should go through my attorney. I signed it and sealed it. Margaret was in the garden when I came to find her. October again, almost exactly a year from when this had started. The same flat Carolina light in the afternoon sky. She was cutting back the last of the season's herbs, her movements unhurried. She looked up when she heard my footstep on the stone path. "Letter from Brandon," I said. She looked at me for a moment. What did it say? That he was sorry and wanted to know if there was a path forward. What did you write back? That there isn't one. She turned back to the garden. She worked in silence for a moment, her hands steady with the pruning shears, and then she said, "Good." We didn't speak about it again that day. There are things you believe about family when you are building one. That blood is a foundation that holds no matter what weight is placed on it. That love between parents and children is not transactional, cannot be corrupted, will not break under the pressure of ordinary hardship. You believe these things and you build your life on them, and you never think to question whether the foundation is actually there until something shows you the empty space underneath. Margaret and I sat on the back porch in November, the evening after we'd had the estate documents revised for the final time. The hospital, where she had worked for 19 years, would receive everything after us. We'd added a provision for Frank Torres as well. A meaningful gift, not enormous, the kind of specific acknowledgement that comes from understanding exactly how close the outcome might have been without one person's willingness to act. The city was quiet at that hour. Leaves down, the trees bare, the neighborhood still. "Do you regret it?" Margaret asked. "Any part of the way you handled it?" I thought about that honestly. About calling Daniel Marsh, about the civil lawsuit, about coordinating with the DA, about the letter I'd sent Brandon and the one I hadn't sent Cassie because her attorney had requested no direct contact. No, I said. I'd make every choice again, even cutting him off completely. Especially that. Margaret reached over and took my hand. The same hand she'd held in hospital rooms and courtrooms, and 31 years of ordinary evenings. She held it the same way she always had, with both of hers slightly colder than mine. I spent a long time in that hospital bed trying to understand how he got there, she said. How a person raised in a decent family, with every reasonable advantage, arrives at a decision like that. Did you find an answer? No. I think some people encounter a pressure point that reveals something that was always there. You can't know it's there until the pressure comes. She was quiet for a moment. I just don't want us to spend the rest of our lives trying to explain something that might not be explainable. All right. I want to go to Asheville next month, she said, and New Orleans in the spring. I want to use the money while we're well enough to enjoy it. All right, I said again, and I want you to call Frank Torres and invite him to dinner. He lives alone. I don't think anyone has cooked him a real meal in some time. I'll call him tomorrow. Tonight, she said. I called Frank Torres that evening from the back porch while Margaret made tea in the kitchen. He answered on the third ring, surprised, then genuinely pleased. He said he'd drive up from Raleigh the following weekend if the invitation was real. It's real, I told him. After I hung up, I sat for a few minutes in the dark with the cold phone in my hand, looking at the lights of the city spreading out beyond our yard. All those ordinary windows, all those ordinary evenings, people going about their lives inside the specific weight of whatever they were carrying. A year ago, I had driven a familiar highway, worried about a wife who wasn't returning my calls, telling myself simple explanations had to exist. They hadn't, of course. The explanation was not simple at all. It was the oldest kind of story, a family's love tested against greed and found to be, in one direction at least, hollow all the way through, but not in every direction. Margaret had survived. We had fought for her. Frank Torres had made one phone call in the dark that changed everything. The machines of the law had done what they were built to do, imperfectly and slowly and with tremendous friction, but they had done it. I had asked for accountability and received it. That was enough to build a life forward from. Not a complete repair. Scars like this don't close entirely, but a foundation. The same one I had believed in before I had reason to question it. Not restored through innocence, but through something harder and more durable. Through what we'd proven we were willing to do for each other when the simple explanation turned out to be wrong. Margaret brought 2 cups of tea to the back porch and sat beside me. We held our cups. We looked at the November sky, which was clear and dark and enormous above Charlotte. Thank you, she said. You don't have to thank me. I know I don't have to, she said. I want to. We sat together for a long time after that, not saying much, in the way of people who have spent 42 years learning that some things are better held than spoken. The city lit the edges of the sky. Somewhere nearby, a neighbor's porch light came on, its small brightness absolutely ordinary, absolutely enough. If this story reached you tonight, it means you were paying attention. Please share it with someone who should hear it too.